Now, it sounds like you may have spent a good bit of your career, most of your career, being a champion for the top half of the funnel because you've gone from working at BBDO. Was that in New York in the 90s?
That was actually in Atlanta back in the late 90s, right? But
Ah,
then I
interesting.
quickly then turned after that because I found it to be interesting. But to be honest,
Yeah.
I couldn't afford to work there. It was not a very lucrative entry level job, advertising in the 90s. And just by happenstance, and this was early internet, I got a job in sales, a big tech research firm, a place called Gartner.
Oh, yeah.
That set me on a path 25 years ago to where I am today, right? Because I love math. I believe it. I could geek. I love statistics. Like it's interesting to me. I love gambling, playing cards, right?
Mm.
Things like that. So that entire universe is appealing to me. And it was really just sort of, it made sense even back in like the late 90s and early 2000s about where things were going as the internet was taking off. And it really,
So what
yeah,
was that
certainly.
pivot point that led you towards specifically data gathering and the the value of data? When did that become sort of blindingly apparent to you?
Well, like anything, right? Better lucky than smart. Like you kind of start there. And I think that it became very apparent to me as because I didn't major in statistics or anything like that. Like I went to a
Mm.
liberal arts college and it was like a lot of history and, like literature and things like that, just different
Mm.
from a lot of mathematics that I had pushed in high school. And so what happened, it was almost like a love story that began right back in like 1999 and began moving was when you really were working with analysts and people that were using the data in order to make decisions. And I thought it was fascinating, like the ability for certain people versus others to be able to look at the exact same piece of information and assess it and come up with different answers, like different ideas, different strategies as a result of it. So that was to me, I thought this is very powerful, right? Like I began to then learn about not just what was tech data at the time, which was really about how many cell phones were being sold versus different types of software that companies were using for ERP systems and whatnot. But
Yeah.
I began to then learn about more marketing science, right? Going back to in the 1970s when UPC codes were on the rise, right? As a way to be able to analyze what was being bought and why at grocery stores, onward
Mm.
to what was the classic way that television and print advertising were bought and sold, right? Related to Nielsen ratings or MRI, which was doing analysis around like ads in magazines and how much they mattered or didn't matter. And I just found that type of analysis, like that direction, very interesting. And that was really what set me on the path because the internet was so young. Everybody was trying to apply like these classic offline advertising principles to online. And it worked for a hot second until things
Mm.
began to exponentially explode across not only the US, but the world. And new ways of analyzing data had to be considered, right? It was not as simple
Mm.
as like Nielsen television families, right? Like you really needed to innovate. So I think that was really the turn for me was when you saw the explosion of the amount of data and what broke between the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things.
Mm.
And then eventually watching those two things like bifurcate, but then have to come back together because they both apply, right? So I think that was watching that journey over the course of the early 2000s was radicalized me, if you will, as it
Ah,
related to
yeah.
data and what I believe it could or couldn't do.
But I'm so fascinated by your kind of founder story. So we've talked about your early career and all that, but as a founder, what have been the kind of hardest things about going from literally founding this, presumably in a coffee shop or your bedroom or something,
Right.
or an office, spare office somewhere, to where you are today? What are the kind of hardest lessons you've learned there, you think?
Well, so first of all, it was from the couch, right? It was to
Ah,
tell you exactly where it happened with myself and my two co-founders, Serge and
great.
Stan. And it was mid 2020, so it was COVID. It was during lockdown. Like this
Wow.
was done where Serge and Stan, we never even physically met each other for
Oh,
18
wow.
months as a result of COVID. Like we had met basically over LinkedIn
God.
and then had some mutuals in common amongst us that led us
Huh.
together with Semrush as our mutuals between us and our initial seed investor. So that's one, right? It was definitely done from the couch in my condo here in New York City,
Hmm.
um, all virtual right from the beginning. So a few things I could say because this is also, it's fascinating to me as well because I look back on it. I am not a serial entrepreneur. It's not as if I've been entrepreneuring,
Yeah.
if you will, for the past
Mm.
25 plus years. But sometimes, an opportunity presents itself. And I would say that it's one thing to be in a position to be able to recognize an opportunity when it presents itself. But more importantly, when it comes to founding a business, you have to be in a position to be able to like actually take advantage of said opportunity. And
Mm.
through any number of like decisions and successes and failures and all of these things that blended together leading into mid 2020, I was finally in a position on a personal level to feel that I could take this chance, right? So that was one, is that past is prologue when it comes to founding a business, right? Like, not everybody just sitting on a trust fund or like, people got bills to pay. You got stuff
Yeah.
to do, right? Like it's not, you have rich benefactors to be able to take care of them. So that's the first one that I would say to anybody is that your ability to be able to found a company and then to be successful and weather what's going to be any number of ups and downs, um, you need to be able, it's what's come before you, right? It takes time, right? Like
Mm.
diamonds are made out of like pressure and time, if you will. So that's the first thing that I would say is most important. From there, first things first, every meeting that you have is going to be when are we out of money? Like start there, right? Is that I
Yeah.
don't care about raising money, not raising money. That's your first thing, right? Is that we need to keep the lights on. So our entire tact was not about just R&D forever and like raising money and like building moats and like all of these different cliches.
Hmm.
It was what is the purpose of this business? And it is to build things that we know sell, right? We look through a sales lens as our number one thing here
Mm.
is that we have to focus on selling things, revenue. And we moved
Revenue
into
as soon as
profit.
possible,
Yeah,
basically.
like just not at all costs, but you need to like sit down and think about what it is that you're selling and
Mm.
find a path to revenue as quickly as you can, right? Like I think that, you everybody, especially like how things were done over the past 15 plus years related to raising money and, the gold
Yeah.
rushes at various times related to crypto or AI right
Mm.
now. And like, don't worry about profitability. It's revenue growth at all costs and so on and so forth. Well, that was also all during like what was effectively around the globe a zero interest rate phenomenon environment, if you will.
Mm.
ZIRP, as would be called here, zero interest rate phenomenon tends to be the shorthand that we'll use here in the United States for it.
Right.
During ZIRP times, nobody cared about profit, right? Margin, things like that. So that's a second piece when I think back to how we went about founding and running the business was we took that tack that the salad days of low interest rates were going to end at one point. So we needed to make sure that we had an idea that was going to get us to like actual revenue much faster than it might have been in the 2010s, if you will.
Interesting. Interesting. And then you were acquired by Semrush.
That is correct. That was December of 2023.
That's pretty good going. 3 years, just over 3 years, and you get the acquisition. What was the first thing that went through your head when Semrush first used the word acquisition?
Sure. Well, I remember it very specifically because we were out to dinner, here in
Mm.
New York, and I've known them. They were initial seed investors, so I certainly have a
Mm.
we have a relationship with Semrush, and I've known them also as clients many years before that, right? So
Yeah.
again, going back to the how it passed as prologue in your life, right, in your
Yeah.
career, things don't. It's not like lightning strikes, right? These are things that build up over time.
Yeah.
So anyway, I knew that we were going to be sitting down to have a discussion. I didn't know it was exactly this. It could have been in any number of ways. But listen, to be honest, the first thing that goes through your mind is the money. You immediately are like, how much? Right? But like you kind of get over that real quickly because it matters. Money matters, right, in the world. But put that aside for a minute, is that the real question that you start with is why, right? Like start there. Because the selling of a business is about not just, it's like planting a tree. It's not what it looks like today, but what is it going to look like in another 5 or 10 years, right? Like
Mm.
that's sort of the landscape architecture of Central Park, if you will, right? Was what's all this going to look like in 50 years? So on a much shorter scale, the why is you start with, it's not just about the money. Remember that, Datos is a collection of people and everybody that works here and their families that depend on them and like investors and all of the wealth that gets built. It's not just about like financial wealth, but about like the perpetual ability for people to be able to succeed, right? So you sit back and you say, well, why does Semrush want this? Why would this be appropriate for us? Why would this work for everybody? As in, because again, when somebody comes to acquire you, they don't just say, well, here's the money, thanks, and peace out, right? Like they're looking at, we will acquire you, and then we need to continue to build, right,
Yeah.
over the course of the next however many years, right? Because there's more money to be had. There's, you know, you have like earnouts, you have all these different things. So again, it's
Mm.
not about just what the business is today. The value of businesses is also about their worth many years from now. And then not only the founders, but the team and the
Yeah.
product and all these things that you've built. So
Mm.
it goes back to, again, you then really like, once you get past, you're like, the money's, you're just like seeing dollar signs or, what have you. You get
Yeah.
past that real fast. And then you really have that, you start to just have a call to come to Jesus moment, right? If you to use that, which is just, why are we doing this? Like, why does this matter? And then that begins a
Mm.
set of discussion, to me, that is much more fruitful, right? Because just because somebody comes up and says, hey, we're thinking about acquiring you or making an offer,
Mm.
you got many months of like diligence. Like it's now going to like
Yeah.
everybody is now going to dive in. It's all just based off of like surface stuff. But now we're talking about a deep dive into everything that like your business and you personally have done and all these different types of things. It doesn't happen overnight, right? Like
No, no.
it takes a long time. So just because somebody makes an offer doesn't mean deals close, right? So that's what I say by, you put the money aside because that doesn't matter. That'll be the end result of what is a successful acquisition.
Yeah.
But you need to start to get your head around about why this is important to the acquiring company, why
Yeah.
it's important to your company, and then figuring out how to be able to circle the wagons around what's important to you and your team and your employees and your business, because it's easy to get swallowed up, right, by somebody else and then not have, and as we talked
Mm.
about earlier in the podcast, agency, not to have the agency to be able to do what you need to do because you get
Yeah.
acquired, you're giving up control, right?
Yeah.
Like that's, you
Yeah.
have to come to grips with that. So there's a
Mm.
degree of protectionism that you have to take towards the exercise, which is slow down, yay, money, but slow down and think about like why this is, why now? Like, why not
Yeah.
later? Like, so that to me is really the core. Like once you get past the emotional reaction, um, the
Yeah.
thing that really matters is that.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, it sounds like I was going to ask you about, advice for aspiring founders who dream of an exit via acquisition, and you've kind of answered it there. But is there anything else quickly to mention there to founders who dream of that exit?
Yeah, there's actually a very tactical thing that I would recommend to everybody, which is when you found a company, that's all great. You're like, yay, I founded something. But there's a lot of like legal and financial things that go into founding a company, right? Am I going to do in America, am I going to do a limited liability corporation?
Yeah.
Is a partnership? Is it a C corp, which is like a corporation? What are the accounting rules I'm going to apply to what we have going on that impacts how you pay taxes and so on and so forth? But I mention all of that because if your intention is that you are starting a business that you are eventually going to or would be acquired by a much bigger company, as soon as possible, you need to start setting up your business in the way that big companies set themselves up when it comes to finance, accounting, legal, and
Mm.
whatnot.
Yeah.
Because if you set up as an LLC and you eventually take on investors, they're going to want to reorganize here in the United States as what's called a C Corp, right?
Yeah.
That is a corporation that has different, that's like stock structure, and that governs like the taxes that you pay and like any number of things. Accounting, right? Here in the United States, you can set up and you have what's called cash based accounting, which is you just run it based on money in, money out, right? Be like, we
Yeah.
made profit this year because we brought in more money than we sent out. But in big companies, especially public companies, they have what's called GAAP accounting, generally accepted accounting principles. And that is
That's
like
right.
very
Yeah.
formal ways that they look at accounting, and they call it accrual basis. So there's a big difference between what a cash-based business would call profit versus
Mm.
what a GAAP accounting business would call non-working capital, right? And I can explain that in detail, but I'm using that as
No, it's all right.
examples here is that if you want to sell your business, right, the sooner that you can start getting it set up in ways that big businesses look at things, it's
Yeah.
going to be able to help that transition, the ability for them to acquire you.
Yep.
Because that type of thing is going to come out in due diligence. And then you have to figure out, like, how do we all get together and agree on the
Yeah.
value of the business in the end?
Yeah, that's true. That, in fact, funnily enough, some of the things you sort of mentioned in there take me back to when I started an agency. I co-founded an agency in London, and I went out and literally bought a business accounting for dummies from the For
Right.
Dummies range of books. But because I thought I really need to know about things like GAAP accounting and EBITDA and stuff, because someone's got to know about this. None of the other two
Right.
guys weren't interested, so I thought, yeah. So I think a bit of financial literacy as well is probably quite good, isn't it?